voiced now within these alternative paradigms of religion development framework. And the reason really was that much of the nationalist leadership recognized that religious communities were internally differentiated along lines of caste, gender, language, region. So they could not really be treated as a cohesive entity. They may have shared cultural needs and cultural concerns and even religious concerns, and that needed to be addressed. So there was this convenient division of sorts that was made between, treating people as members of religious communities when it came to matters, quote unquote, involving much more of the private matters, that is family life, but not necessarily when it comes to matters of citizenship. Now the issue therefore really is, should religion enter into questions of which are central to citizenship, questions that we are dealing with public policy involving delivery of development goods of various kinds. What we did really was that we didn't begin, as in our study, we didn't really begin by looking at religious communities, partly because that framework didn't suit the requirements, given the fact that we were analyzing this in India and religious communities had not been treated as one single aggregate unit. So what we tried to do really was to look at some of the mobilizations of marginalized sections and try to choose a kind of case studies which would reach out to or perhaps allow us to deal with mobilizations of marginalized communities in different religious communities. And we supplemented this by looking at the way in which religious political parties, which claim to speak on behalf of the entire community, reach out to the marginalized sections. What are their agendas? How do they reach out to these marginalized sections? How do marginalized movements of the marginalized really connect with and draw upon the resources that might be available to them simply because they have an organized political formation in that particular state? So these were the twin axes around which we began our study. The study was conducted primarily in Punjab and Maharashtra. The reasons for this are clear, because both states had a very strong religious political parties of different kinds. So Punjab allowed us really to look at marginalized sections, and we focused there on the mobilizations by the Valmiki and Mazhabi communities. So there were groups of the scheduled caste and their mobilization, which are very, very strong, particularly since the late 90s and early 21st century, 2000 onwards. And there's a reason for it. I'll come back to that later on. It also allowed us to look at some of the these mobilizations also drew upon not just the Sikh community and its relatively marginalized sections, but also those of the Hindu community. And we also looked simultaneously at the mobilizations of the Neo-Buddhists in Maharashtra, which allowed us really to look at much more centrally scheduled class and therefore marginalized sections, who decided to move out of the majority community, move out of the religious community and form an independent religious group. We looked at a third mobilization, and that was of the OBC Muslims in Maharashtra. And this allowed us really to look at three different kinds of groups. Marginalized sections within the dominant religious community. It allowed us also to look at marginalized scheduled caste within the Sikh community, which is a national minority at the national level, but majority within Punjab. So does that context allow it really to have a particular kind of nexus between religion, marginalized communities, and the capacity really to make claims and demands of regarding development? And of course, it allowed us also, the third case study allowed us really to look at Muslims who remain a minority within the region as well as the national context, and see how issues of development really are being articulated there. I'm going to skip a lot of details simply because we don't have that much time. I won't get into details of the three studies that we undertook, case studies of the three mobilizations, but I will share with you some of the conclusions that emerged regarding this broad theme with which we began. I think when it came to Punjab, it was quite clear that Akali Dal had played a very critical role in organizing and leading the Sikh community, both at the time of making a demand for a separate state, whether it was on grounds of separate state for the Sikhs, or subsequently on the basis of a linguistic identity Punjabi identity. It was also at the forefront of the entire demand for greater autonomy to the federal unit under the Anandpur resolution. So it had already mobilized the Sikh community in its entirety. And as I mentioned, we looked at the kind of support religious parties are able to elicit from the community, the manner in which they deal with issues of marginalized sections, and thirdly, do marginalized communities see this availability or presence of an organized religious group as a resource, and were they able to draw on it. And our findings were something like this, that even though the Akali Dal had been a strong political party, and there were reasons why the Sikh community had actually been able to draw its boundaries quite firmly, partly because of the anti-Sikh riots that occurred in 1984, partly because of the history of conflict since the Anandpur resolution. So the identity had congealed quite strongly. And yet, if you look at electoral performances throughout, even in the 1980s, you find that there is a significant amount of votes that the Congress continues to get in Punjab. In fact, its vote share is consistently, almost entirely at the time of assembly elections, marginally higher or comparable with that of the Akali Dal. And it only declines once in the 1980s and then again in 1997, and it's able to is able to get back its support. So the first thing really is that quite clearly, when it came to the political and public domain, the community was taking decisions not as a cohesive single unit that sometimes may be compared to think in terms of empires and so on and so forth. So they were internally differentiated and were looking at their interests in a differentiated manner. That's point number one. Secondly, and that was the variable that hadn't been introduced in any of those earlier hypotheses that came from the religion development frameworks. And that is the dimension of democracy. Participatory electoral politics, competitive in nature, seeking to win support and consolidated vote share. Now Congress, as I said, in Punjab already had a fairly large vote share and wanted to consolidate it even further. So in 1975, when Jani Zayal Singh was the chief minister there, he initiated a policy. There was no immediate groundswell for it, no strong mobilization compelling the government to act in this way. But I think the dynamics of electoral politics pushed him into thinking of ways how he could wean away or at least consolidate his vote share even among sections of the Sikh community. So what he does is he introduces a sub-quota within the quota that is reserved for the scheduled caste in Punjab, which is sizable. So, and he reserves that for the Balmiki Mazhabi component, cluster of castes within this larger quota of reservations that is available in Punjab. Thereby weaning away this group which has aspirations, which has a desire really to be accepted and to be treated like an equal member of the Sikh community. Nevertheless, their development concerns the fact that we are lagging behind, they don't have adequate opportunities for education, not that they don't have, but for a variety of historical reasons and occupational reasons, they just were not quick enough to get into the educational process, while the other caste clusters within the scheduled caste had been able to get an edge over. So he weans away this group by initiating a sub-quota policy, something which will become exemplary in the region close by, in the regions close by, in Haryana and UP and so on and so forth subsequently. Eventually, of course,
politics has made it incumbent perhaps on the so-called non-religious parties to begin to forage in religious territory. And you have argued with the margin that this is something that these parties have begun to do, to differentiate, help differentiate religious groups or communities. Do you think that to some extent this was also necessitated by the fact that these so-called religious parties may be entering the secular domain and taking away some of the ideological charge of secular parties, or did secular parties on their own enter religious politics simply because they wanted to outdo one another. For example, in the case of Punjab, as you well know, I don't know if the Akali Dal in this Anandpur Sahib resolution had anything specifically religious, but the way in which the secular party, the Congress party, reacted was perhaps on its own condition. The point I'm asking is that did the secular parties find it incumbent to enter that ground because religious parties were invading the areas, or was it a one-sided move? And to you, I would like to know if the supply side factors, what are the features of the supply side that can explain some of the reticence regarding attending madrasas, A, and B, notwithstanding the supply side deficiencies, how did the number grow so rapidly? Do you think the numbers grew rapidly because of some degree of state patronage given to these people? Because the states, the governments often tend to promote religious virtuosos in the hope that they'll also get votes to them. This in a way links up with the earlier question because it is about how the different organizations step outside their traditional domain to win political favor.
Thank you for the question, because I think you're absolutely right that it is probably a two-way process. Once religion is present in the public domain, and religious groups, religious communities and their concerns can be tabled, they're obviously up for grabs. Anybody can use them to their advantage as and when it is necessary. And there is this, again, call it a dialectical kind of process. Initially, the Akali Dal does use the religious identity card to consolidate its demand for a separate state, etc. Changes it, modifies it, so it already has a groundswell. But eventually takes on many other concerns of development, agricultural crisis, other kinds of demands that have irrigation issues that are there. Subsequently, of course, federal-state relations are taken up very centrally by the association with Tamil Nadu, and this is becoming the consolidated. But once both these elements are there, there are these general development concerns of the community or the region as a whole, as well as some religious concerns. Well, the other political parties, so-called secular political parties, are willing also to play the same card and use one in order to diffuse the other. So take attention away from development issues by really using religious and religious community issues, dividing them, speaking in terms of separate interests between these various groups, or just using religious issues in terms of holy city of Amritsar and so on and so forth, etc. Certainly, I want to say this, that there is this ongoing dialogue. But that's the difference that comes about once you allow religion to enter into public domain and allow religious political parties really to be part and parcel of the democracy.
I think that is also part of this project. One point that emerges is kind of this, what she was saying, two-way thing, is the relationship between state and religion when it comes to questions of governance and development. I think one has to separate it from question of politics and religion. I think these are two different kinds of issues. And all the three case studies suggest whenever it's question of concrete issues of governance or development, state tries to differentiate through electoral process and disaggregate through policy process the religious communities. And for religious communities also, if the issue is presented to the state in a disaggregated manner, if Muslims go to the state as OBC Muslims, state finds it much easier to address their developmental concerns. If they go to the state as Muslim community, it's much more difficult for the state to deal with it. So even when Shiv Sena was in power, the OBC demand among Muslims could not really be communalized or rejected. It was seen as a kind of governance and development agenda, and it could be engaged with by the state actors even if they were kind of, of a very different orientation. Same is the case with the Punjab. When you present your case as in caste terms, even when it is mobilized around religion, it becomes much easier for the state to engage with it. And the political process also tries to disaggregate religious communities if it has to deal with questions of development and governance.
Just to see whether I've got your question right, what you had asked was that why did the numbers in madrasa grow, right, post-independence? And the second thing was why within the socio-economic profile of the madrasa students, why did it change? Was that the first question? Why it is still 4%? Yeah, right. I think a lot of much of the answer for this has come from I think lecture name, sorry, Aftab. Right? Aftab, what he said earlier. First of all, these numbers that I have quoted and which you see in various documents, these numbers are just guesses, more or less. I mean, nobody has a very good idea as to what it is. So you get these range of figures. So one is really not sure whether it's grown to such an extent, but definitely it has grown. The reason is two. One is because in these Muslim-dominated areas, there are no schools. There are no schools at all. The parents just want to send their children to some institution. So there's a madrasa nearby, child goes there, but all as a child learn with these madrasas are to perhaps read a bit of the Quran. That is just all. Now, but these institutions are like they run out of small rooms attached to a mosque or or maybe somebody's house, and they really don't teach much. So many of the parents in these smaller areas which doesn't have access to fairly large madrasas but have these smaller madrasas with numbers they are there, they rather not send their children to these schools. So what happens is in numbers the madrasas are there maybe catering to 10 or 12 students, but the children do not go to even those madrasas because there's nothing much being taught there. So there's this dichotomy which gives you a picture that numbers of schools, the number of madrasas perhaps has increased, but still children don't go. If they have a chance, they would obviously prefer to go to regular schools. Even in some of these Muslim areas, especially in UP, I've seen there are small private schools where parents are paying even 10 rupees and children are being sent to those schools also. So the real crux of the matter is that there are no schools, in spite of the fact that government says that access has increased, but these communities do lack access to schools.
We have about 5 minutes, and if there's any one question you'd like to ask anybody, which includes Professor Ghanshyam Shah. Yes? Yeah, just one quick question, that's all. Provided it's from Professor Shah.
Only study and only information, comprehensive information that is available to us is the Satya Committee. And therefore I value that. Because by not studying, one cannot ignore the community and its problems. The important contribution, important point that this book is reiterating, which the sociologists have done it since 60s and 70s, that any caste or a community is not homogeneous. It is not monolithic. You cannot totalize the community, even for the understanding and also policy making. And this point is brought out very sharply in this book. But my reading of the Satya Committee is slightly different than some of the authors of the book. My reading of the Satya Committee is that Satya Committee is also not considering the Muslims as a monolithic community. They write categorically it's not a monolithic community. Satya Committee also use extensively whatever is available. You cannot generate data. Whatever is available as talk about given data about Muslims or OBC Muslims. Satya Committee also does not tell us or does not give a picture of a pan-Indian Muslim identity or Muslim society. My reading that Satya Committee tells us repeatedly that Muslim community has to be seen in the context of the state, given kind of a polity, given kind of economic development. Condition of Muslims are different in Gujarat than of West Bengal or UP. Gujarat and UP, I am just giving example because there are two different kind of ideologies. Gujarat is ruled for the last 15 years by the right wing, and West Bengal is ruled by left wing, and believes in secularism, or doesn't recognize the religion as such. And yet the Muslim condition of Muslims is much backward than that of Gujarat. But I will not conclude, and nor the such a committee has concluded, because of the government. Because what I infer from this report is the nature of development in the state to some extent percolate down the line. That happens to tribal, that happens to Dalit, and that also happens to Muslims. So overall situation of Gujarat in that way also helps all communities, including the Muslims. Despite Gujarat has a more problem of insecurity for the Muslims. Question, how do we deal with religious community? And that is really a worry for all of us, those who are concerned with security. Professor said in his article, talked about ethno-caste and ethno-religion. The measures that we have adopted since independence about the caste or social groups within the caste system, same measures can work for religious minorities. And our uneasiness is this because the kind of history that we have, the parties built on the religion, that makes us more uncomfortable and worrying that whether if we carry out the same categories, perhaps it could be a disaster. And absolutely right. It's also right because the caste as a social group and religion as a social group have different dimensions. And therefore, we have to look the religious groups somewhat differently in terms of policy measures than the caste groups. My own feeling is that unfortunately, certain policy measures that have worked in the country for some time, we just continue to repeat the same measures after 60 years. That certain measures have worked successfully, it should work successfully for all the time, for all the groups. And it is time to re-examine these positions. And it's also time to re-examine what has happened with the reservations for scheduled castes and tribes. What are the problems? It's true that caste assertion is also because of the democratization of the country. At one point of time, the political scientists also talked about the participation of caste as a secularization of the caste. Now, we hesitate to talk about it. At one point of time, it was a fashionable to talk about it. Now, can it apply to the religious community? I have no answer, but one has to go further and discuss. Why a certain measures, certain affirmative actions, not necessarily religious, but any other specifying on the religious communities would, at the long run, defeat the very purpose of democracy, and including secularism. I must also mention that my own reading of Satya Committee, that Satya Committee analyzed at length of the OBC. And implicit argument is that the way in which the certain communities are left out that can be brought into the OBC category and provided. And I think that is the one safest way that one can do. But there are also problems. In the today's seminar, somebody very rightly saying that the whole space of a OBC is overcrowded. We also know from our own experiences of scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, and also OBC, kind of variations and kind of advantage that certain groups take it. Now, if Muslim OBC, they are all already Muslim OBC castes are in there, and whatever the information that we get is that they are lagging far behind the Muslim OBC who got the advantage, got categorized as an OBC. They are not able to get the advantages as the non-Muslims are getting it. You know why this is happening? We cannot ignore this. Because why the certain scheduled castes are getting advantages and why the many scheduled castes are not getting advantages. And we find the tension in Dalit community in all states. That those who are getting advantage and those who are not getting advantage. Perhaps that might repeat here also. The second alternative is government need not intervene because of religious movement. What are its consequences of it? Will that strengthen secularism? My own observations in Gujarat, that state has not intervened even in relief work. The Muslim organizations work, and perhaps because of that, the Muslims were getting advantage.
Ghanshyamji, can you just
2
conclude
minutes.
very shortly because we have no time. It's supposed to finish at 8 o'clock.
Sorry, 2 minutes. So the Muslims are more become faithful to the religious organizations. And the third alternative is universalizations of certain benefits, education, health, and but generally we don't talk about universalizations. Generally we don't